read it as we go. Not doing every single chapter, of course, in Numbers, but we are dealing with a series of things that happen in Numbers. You know, how many of you, is this your favorite book? A lot of times it's an ignored book, and partly because one of the things you run into, thank you, at the beginning is genealogies, and that just, after you, so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so, you get a little tired. But there's a lot of stories in here, there's a lot of events, a lot of happenings. In general, it's about the wanderings, or that's a big portion of it. The book starts at Sinai and ends up back in Kadesh Barnea, or at least working their way to Moab. I think it ends up in Moab, actually. So verse 20, and we'll start in verse 2, or chapter 20. Start in verse 2. Now there was no water for the congregation. So they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, I love this, if only we had died with our brethren, when our brethren died before the Lord. Why? This, by the way, why is not a question, it's an accusation. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, nor is there any water here to drink. So Moses went, and Aaron went, from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and said to them, hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? And then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, probably more literally gushing out. And the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me, to hallow me, or sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I had given them. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. I did title this The Challenge of Trust, which is faith, right? Faith, trust, same thing, believe, trust. Always kind of goes back to that trust. Do we trust God enough? You know, how hard is it to believe God? There's an old saying I was thinking about today. Perhaps you learned it in elementary math. A straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, right? Anytime God tells us to do something, He's given us the shortest distance, right, into getting a good outcome. And our problem sometimes is we just don't trust it. And, you know, it could be lots of reasons. Sometimes it's just because it's scary. And have you ever found it scary to trust God? God says something, and you're in a situation, you say, man, I don't want to do that. Sometimes it's just scary. Sometimes God's will is not ours. And we would like a different outcome. Thank you very much. And so when we're confronted, and suppose you're reading the Bible and you know you got this thing going on, all of a sudden you're confronted with God's truth that perhaps might get in the way of what you want to do. That can be a difficult thing to trust in the Lord in that particular situation. Sometimes, but it's hard sometimes because it's oftentimes not our first impulse. What God suggests is not our first impulse, right? How many of you ever thought, man, I want to give that person a piece of my mind I can't afford to lose, but I'm going to give it to him anyway? And that was your first impulse. And when you think about it, you know, that wouldn't glorify God or bring honor to His name, but boy, you want to. God has never let me get away with that one. I've tried. Thinking, oh, I got it all worked out in my head exactly what it is. It's going to sound so good. And it usually blows up in my face. Sometimes we don't do it because we're prideful. We think we can correct the problem, or we want to be able to correct the problem ourselves. And oftentimes we can't. We can't fix things, and we need to ask God for help. Numbers itself, in the context, you got to understand all the things that are going on. It's 3 cycles of rebellion that happen in this. One ending in November, or Numbers, I want to say November, Numbers 14:45, where the Israelites, remember, after they refused to enter the land, God said, well, then I'm not going to give it to you, and He judged them, and then He says, okay, we're going to go and do it now. And as a result, that was disobedience because it wasn't God's will. Prior to that, they complained about discomfort. They complained about the daily manna. And you know, I kind of get that. I like to eat, you know, and I like the flavors. But it's wrong, you know, and they complained about the daily manna. They complained about Miriam complained about Moses' wife. And that didn't turn out well for them either. So. The second cycle had Korah's rebellion. In the third cycle, we have this thing about water. I should kind of go back to something in the second cycle because it's an interesting story. Moses and Aaron both had a staff. And Aaron's leadership as a priest was being called into question, probably driven by jealousy. By the other Levites and some of the children of Reuben. And so what God had them do is take a leader from each tribe and write their name on the staff, and Aaron had his staff, and they put all the staffs before the Ark of the Covenant at the tabernacle. And you probably had heard this, but you know, overnight, Aaron's staff started budding leaves, and it you know, produced almonds, is what it was. And so that was God's way of affirming Aaron's leadership. And that happened back in Numbers 17. But one of the reasons why, this pattern of grumbling keeps on happening is because trusting God is usually not our first impulse. And trusting God is hard, and trusting God is a challenge. And we are challenged to trust Him. Now, in this particular story, I want to try to make something clear. This is 40 years now, right? These guys came to a place called Kadesh Barnea. It's the second time they've been there. And it's 40 years after the first time, right? When they spied the land and when they disobeyed God. And now God is preparing them to go into the land. It's the second time they've been there. And Kadesh Barnea itself was called a place of springs. So last time they were there, we don't hear of them having the same struggle, not there anyway, of need for water. And I thought about this, a little bit, and I'm trying to put myself in this situation. Have you ever been thirsty? And I don't know that these guys were completely out, or if they had to ration it, or, between them and their flocks, but they kind of had this thirst. And I got to think a kind of perpetual thirst. I can understand the dilemma. So they're in a place, right, where they have three choices on how to respond to this dilemma. And in the episodes before, I say there's only one right response. But the first choice is, instead of focusing on God when you have a problem like that, hey, let's focus on our spiritual leaders. And that's what it is in this particular case, because they blame Aaron and Moses. Now, they've been led by this glory cloud, this Shekinah cloud, this cloud. I mean, they must have been led there by that cloud, I'm assuming. But at the same time, they start grumbling and they start contending with Moses and Aaron and thinking, hey, you messed up. And don't get me wrong, I think they're capable of messing up. I know I'm capable of messing up. But at the same time, that wasn't the right response they should have had. What they should have done, perhaps, and this is kind of how I see what they should have done, is went up to Moses and Aaron and said, hey, we need to pray for water, right? We need to focus on God. We pray for water. They had the problem. The problem was they didn't have water. Oh, I can't get my paper to work with me. When you run into a problem that seems awfully difficult, have you had times like that in the past? At times like that, perhaps where you fell on your face before God, and you found that God was sufficient for that time. I think one of the things that happens oftentimes when we run into extremely difficult situations is we forget how faithful God has been up to that point. I mean, up to this point, and even if they went back 40 years before their fathers, they came into a time after, by the way, God divided the sea and destroyed the Egyptians, right? They came to a place called Rephidim, and there was no water there either. And God provided them water. And the way God provided them water is He had Moses, in this particular case, strike that rock once, and it poured forth water. God did stuff like that. They have a history of God coming through for them. So why are they blaming Moses and Aaron rather than going to God and asking for more? I mean, God is the one, by the way, in the 10th plague, who redeemed them out of Israel, right? And protected their households with a sacrificial Passover lamb. Time and time again. God gave them manna when they had nothing to eat. God even gave them quail. God caused their clothes not to wear out these 40 years. Can you imagine that? Never have to go to Walmart's for 40 years. So we have a problem sometimes when we look to leadership, and I would say even our nation's leadership, when we look for them as the answer. It's called Christian nationalism, and it's a dangerous place to put your faith. Right? At the end of the day, what we need is for God to come through for us. And what we need for God, as it's been coming out in prayers, is really revival. We can change laws, but what we need in this country is for God to change hearts. Well, the second part of this, Moses and Aaron start out this right, by the way, and they began to focus on God. They get away. They went away from the assembly that was opposing them or attacking them or whatever, and they went and found the face of God. They went to the temple, and the temple was a place where God manifested His presence. And as soon as they got to the temple, it said the glory of the Lord showed up, right? You know, it showed up probably in the glory cloud. They knew the presence of the Lord. That was a reminder of them that God was with them. Not only them, but with the children of Israel. Because their first response here was a correct one. They're going to go to the Lord. They're not going to try to justify their actions or try to even defend themselves from what I can see here, but they're going to go pray to the Lord. And when they get to the temple and they see God's presence, they fall on their face. Have you ever prayed on your face before? I'm just asking. I haven't. Well, maybe I have before. I'm thinking maybe we need to do that a little bit more. So they went. Where do you go when you are outnumbered, confronted with opposition? And Crouch brings this out. I think it's kind of interesting. He says, you know, this position of on their face before the Lord is a position of interceding for the people. Which is interesting to me. That even though, you know, time and time again they faced attacks from their own people, they intercede for them. Time and again, and they love them. And they've seen this before. They've seen this before, both Moses and Aaron. They've seen it 40 years ago. You know, when their fathers rebelled. And they knew that this was a dangerous thing to do. So they fell on their face before the Lord. And then they received instruction. The first thing they were told is to take the staff. Now, what staff are they taking away? Well, we find out in verse 9, it's from the tabernacle. So this is Aaron's staff that they're talking about. Why would it take Aaron's staff? Particularly since, by the way, did you remember what God told them to do in this particular instance? They weren't supposed to strike the rock at all. They were supposed to speak, right? Speak to the rock. In the staff itself, remember, that was an indication of spiritual authority before God. It was particularly for Aaron, but in this case, probably both Aaron and Moses. It's sort of a pecking order. You know what the pecking order means? Don and Linda, do you know what pecking order means? You should know what pecking order means, right? Because it's a chicken term, right? It's chicken terms. So if a female hen becomes dominant, their dominance is demonstrated by they can peck the other ones, right? And if they're higher in rank, they can peck it without receiving anything, any kind of retribution. And it's part of the problem with the human animal is they try to set up their own pecking orders. Like, I can do what I want, and I can treat you this way, but I wouldn't expect you to treat me that, because I'm higher than you. I find this at work, That's pecking order. I was reading a book called St. Solomon's Ring, and it's actually a book by a German. This is a little older, but he was a German zoologist, I believe, and he was talking about jackdaws, and he was keeping a colony of them. He said they had a pecking order, they would keep a pecking order, and they had the top bird, was a male. And he ended up marrying, to use kind of a parlance, one of the bottom female birds. And so the female bird just got a promotion, right? There's a top one and there's a second. And you would think that this jackdaw, who had been treated so badly by the other birds, because she was, would come up and be gracious and kind. But she was terrible to every other bird, that had been mean to her. That's human behavior there. And it's amazing to me that these leaders, time and time again, they're not perfect, and we're going to find that out in a minute, but time and time again, they go to God in intercession for these people. They are attacked, but they love, for the most part. They have their limits, but for the most part. So God instructed him to take the staff, gather the assembly, get them around, and then speak to the rock, right? Speak to the rock. And I think there's something we have to remember here. Something I'm going to bring out in this third part of the phrase, but just remember, God is dealing with his people who are complaining with mercy and grace. God is dealing with his people. That's his purpose, is to deal with them with mercy and grace. And so Moses and Aaron start out pretty good. They have this problem, they have this issue, they have this force coming against them, and what do? They go and seek the Lord, right? They fall on their face before him, and they receive from the Lord. They receive instruction on what to do. Now you think that, because Moses had a pattern, by the way, of obeying the Lord, you'd think that he'd do it so in this case, but he does kind of blow it here. Because the third point is, and now this is what doesn't work. Looking at the opposition and not at God. Looking and focusing on the opposition. And that can be what? Lack of water. It can be people. Right? It can be anything. So what Moses did, he did take the staff as it was commanded him out of obedience. And he did gather the people. But what did he say? Then Moses lifted his hand, verse 11, and struck the rock twice with his rod. Actually, let's go back to 10. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels. Must we bring water?" What's wrong with that statement? Must we bring water? Yeah. God's the one who's going to bring water. They're just instruments, right? Must we bring water out for you? And you see what's happening here. And this is a difficult text by any stretch of it. I've watched commentators fight back and forth on this, but essentially the idea certainly seems to be this. First of all, Moses is angry. He's just mad. I mean, he's mad. He goes out and he starts out by trying to do what God tells him to do, but he hasn't dealt with this anger issue. By the way, Moses had kind of an anger issue problem, didn't he? He killed the taskmaster, remember that? There's a couple times, he let anger get the better of him, but in the process, he robbed the glory from God. Now, I'm assuming, and I don't get all of this, I just don't, but I'm assuming that if he did it exactly what God said, the people would have seen it and said, wow, look at what God can do. But because Moses did it the way he did it, the people, first of all, probably thought, well, he did it, but, he's an angry dude. He's mad. And God must be angry too. But God wasn't angry. There's an element going on here. I want you to see this. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:4, speaking of this incident, he said, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. I think there's a typology going on here, by the way, which Cole says that Moses kind of messed it all up. You see, 40 years ago, at a place called Rephidim, Moses was told, right, because they didn't have water there, and they complained, and Moses was told to go out and strike a rock. Once, by the way, not twice, once, and water would pour out for them. And that happened 40 years ago. In this particular case, Moses goes out and he's told not to strike the rock, but speak to it. In other words, pray and ask. And it'll be given. And here's what Paul is referring to. This is what the commentators pick up that I probably would miss if I didn't know it. That striking the rock is a picture of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. You see, striking the rock is a picture of the... Christ only had to be crucified once. Right? He only had to be crucified once. This rock is a picture of Christ because from Christ, remember, Christ offered living water. Remember that? And so in the second time, 40 years later, it's supposed to be the exalted Christ, a picture of the exalted Christ, and His grace and mercy, and you just ask and you'll get what you need. And these people certainly deserved the wrath of God. I mean, they were not, acting rightly, but God wanted to give them mercy. Let me tell you something, beloved. I certainly deserve the wrath of God. That's not what God gave me. And that's mercy. Right? That's not earned, right? I didn't earn it. God didn't look down one day and said, really wish I could have Rick on my side. I'd have it made if he became a Christian. That would be awesome. And nor did He do that for any of you. He just loved you. He wanted you. And somewhere along the line you received that message. You got it. And you came. And you loved Him back because He first loved you. Now here, 40 years later, Moses is letting his anger and his emotion get in the way, and he goes out and, he says, well, God said this, but I'm mad. This is what I'm assuming happened, right? Because he certainly was angry in how he expressed it. Strikes the rock twice. But that's not a picture of God's grace. And it's one of the challenges we have, right? And you know this, guys. Sometimes I come home or come back and I go to Bible study, or I come to church and I got to tell you I sinned at work because I got mad at somebody. And then I had to apologize to that person, and I had to go through all this stuff. Why? Because I don't want anything to get in the way of me in Christ. I know I blow it. That's not the issue. Christ died for me. And he didn't have to die again. That's what Hebrews tells us, right? Christ died once for sin. Moses kind of messed all that picture up that God was creating there in numbers. And as a result, both Moses and Aaron, by the way, were guilty here, according to the text and according to the context. And as a result, neither of them made it into the land which they were leading the people. So Moses died on the outside, just like the people who died in the wilderness. Remember, except for Caleb and Joshua, those who were over 20 at the time, all died in the wilderness. And that seems severe. Does it not? I've always struggled with that. For years I have, anyway. But at the end of the day, Moses, when he's on I think it was on the Mount of Moab or the plain of Moab, he's praising God. At the end of the day, Moses is still praising God. And by the way, Moses did make it into that land. You know when? The Mount of Transfiguration. He was there. The reason why his punishment was so much more than the others is because of his position, his responsibility. And by the way, you're going to teach. You're going to take a position of authority in the church. And I say authority with some reservation, but it still is. You're under God's authority. If you're going to do that, you're going to be held to a higher standard. People sometimes wonder why I won't agree with them. I'll tell you why I don't agree with people sometimes when they come and ask me something. It's because I'm scared of God. I just know. I mean, I know I don't do everything right, but if I knowingly tell them something that I can't see in Scripture, I am going to hear about it. And so my intent is to give you what the Scripture's saying. I'm not saying I'm perfect at it. That's not the point. And I want you to catch in this. This is what we have God on the mercy and grace side. Remember, that's his nature, that's his desire, that's his desire. He can't always give mercy and grace. Sometimes he has to give judgment, but he wants to give mercy.
Is it okay if I add out?
Yes, it is.
Right?
I am a member.
Wants to.
Thank you.
And so try to remember that. Well, what are your options? It's challenging, I know. Well, you can wander around for 40 years. Or, hey, what you could do is just focus on somebody in leadership and start complaining about them. That'll solve the problem, right? Or you could focus on the people who might be opposing you, or you could trust in God. At the end of the day, Moses failed in this particular case. And let me leave you with a quote. I just remembered I had this, but I like it. And I want you to think about this quote. This is from Irving Johnson. This is the guy I ran into when I first became a Christian, but I like what he said. He said, in short, our profession that we believe in Jesus is authenticated or substantiated by our obedience. You hear what he's saying? Our profession that we believe in Jesus is authenticated or substantiated by our obedience. It doesn't do much good, beloved, to say you believe in Jesus and don't care to obey him. He goes on to say, which validates our profession as a genuine profession. Now, beloved, I realize none of us are going to do this perfectly, but that's not the point. Is it your desire to obey Jesus? That's what it comes down to. Is it your desire to find out what he wants you to do and do it wherever you find it? Amen?